When I set out to do my podcast in the first place, I wanted to talk about things that interested me, the topics about Disney that kind of caught my attention. And then we hit the pandemic and things kind of changed. I had to rethink my own strategy on what I wanted to do, and I had a lot of different thoughts about where I was going to go with it. And I thought maybe I'd do more historical type things and talk about the history of Disney and some of the other fun things that were there. And I started doing that, and then I discovered quickly that I really couldn't because there's so much news to talk about. So I've kind of become this news outlet to a point where I talk about news that's relevant and interesting, that kind of fits within my own scheme of the way I want to talk about things, the kinds of things that interest me. And so I talk a lot about the news segments and a lot of things like that that I think are relevant, but I don't want to do only news. So I'm going to go back and forth between doing news and other things that are of interest and just sort of collect the news items and put them in one podcast. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Kind of back and forth things. I really would prefer to talk about historical things at Disney. It just doesn't seem right now. It's fun, don't get me wrong, but it just, with all the things that are happening, it just feels like there's got to be more to it. There's got to be more I'm talking about news-oriented wise. So there's a lot of things to talk about, so I'll get into those. Here, I'm just going to review some of the highlights of things I talked about on my podcast. But let me know what you think. Is this working, not working? What do you think about it? On the podcast, I start by talking about Joe Rohde. Joe contributed a whole lot to the Walt Disney Company over his 40 years with the company. A lot of the designs, thoughts, and some of the Imagineering really is attributable to him in the long term, and he has that connection to Walt Disney through one generation removed. I also talk about mask wearing, and there were several incidents where guests were removed from the park for not wearing their masks. And it's a little interesting the way Disney responded to it, but I think they're doing the right thing generally. Now, sometimes you only hear one side of the story, you don't hear the whole thing, so it's hard to know exactly where the truth lies sometimes, but I just thought it was interesting to hear these stories and what people thought and what they were doing. Now, in this case, this country music singer had his family take off their masks, and they're the ones that I have a problem with just because they took the rules on themselves and decided what they were going to do in order to enjoy themselves. And I don't think that's the right thing to do. These are the scanners that Disney has in place now at many of the entrances to the theme parks where they'll take your temperature and check your bag. There's also something about the Brightline and how it's coming together in terms of getting people from South Florida to Orlando and to Disney Springs, and ultimately we'll head over toward the Tampa area. Now, there was one other discussion I was having about Morocco and the Moroccan Pavilion and how that's come under Disney's control at this point, and it's no longer owned and operated by the Moroccan company that used to own it. So kind of an interesting mix there. I talked about Abigail Disney and Elizabeth Warren both having very strong comments about the Disney company and the way they're managing themselves right now through the closures. So I just wanted to point that out. And then, of course, there was a little bit about the minivans and how they're not going to be used anymore. They've stopped operation of the minivan service at this point, and who knows what'll replace it in the future. And I felt the need to give a shout out to The Mandalorian. It is a terrific show that I think really encapsulates all that's right with the Star Wars universe, and it's what the movies should have been. Episodes 7 and 8 and 9 should have been what The Mandalorian is. They should have told the story much like this.